Hello, and welcome to this MBA and BGA webinar on reviewing the development and future in digital assessment in association with Inspera. I'm Natalia Mankowska, Commercial Liaison and Relations Manager for MBA and BGA, and I'm looking forward to an hour of interesting insight. Shortly, I will hand over to Fiona Orell, Account Manager for all UK higher education institutions at Inspera, to introduce our panel for today and start the conversation. Before I do, some housekeeping. We want the session to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, just add them to the question box for us to answer live at the end. If you miss anything, don't worry, because the recording will be available in post-event communications and on the MBA and BGA websites within a week. Without further delay, I'm delighted to hand over to Fiona Orell.
Thank you very much, Natalia. So it's a real pleasure to be with you here today on behalf of Inspera. My background is in higher education and in particular HE assessment practices, but it's a real privilege to be here today on behalf of Inspera to interview Donald Lancaster from the University of Exeter Business School and Tim Wakeley from the University of Bath Business School about their significant wealth of experiences with digital assessment and how they see it developing in the future with all of its affordances and challenges. So in the interests of time and what promises to be a very rich discussion, I'm going to dive straight in with my first question and ask you both how you first became interested in digital assessment.
Well, given that I first became interested as a result of working with Don, I suspect Don should begin.
Okay, well, fair enough. And my answer is pretty straightforward. I had, back in 2017, I had to mark 800 handwritten essays in a period of 3 weeks, which was a lot of marking and wasn't particularly fair to the students involved because clearly there wasn't time to work through all their rather spider-like writing. And that set me thinking there must be a better way. And as luck would have it, I went to an educational conference and saw, in fact, the Inspera platform being exposed for the first time. And it seemed to me that it ticked lots and lots of boxes. Firstly, it levels the playing field in terms of writing. So from a adjudicator or marking point of view, it eliminates bias and increases fairness. It seemed at that time to me to be likely to be very popular with students because you just observe every classroom and they're all using their laptops or their tablets or whatever. They're not handwriting notes anymore and they grow up doing that. So preference was quite good. And obviously when they leave our institutions and go onto the workplace, they're not going to be handwriting either. So using computers is obviously a good thing to do. And then, of course, it seemed to me that it was likely to be an awful lot more sustainable for the planet because we're not chopping down trees. We're not producing hundreds and hundreds of pages of print material, blank pages for them to write on, shipping them around the country in lorries, and then storing them for years in warehouses thereafter. So there's a greater sustainability aspect. And with that comes a greater auditability because you've got a digital file that takes you right from authoring the exam through to final moderation and completion. So it seemed to me like lots of reasons, and that's why I was interested.
That's really interesting.
And I got on board because I had a period out of academia, and I returned in 2018, which is when I met Don. And I'd come back with the intention of using more digital capability in the higher education, in my job in higher education. And so I was very interested when I bumped into Don and he said, we've got these exams running. Do you want to be an invigilator? So I said, yes. So that's how I began. And could see also all the benefits Don mentions actually. And more recently, I would add the benefits are there for our exams team, because of course they send scripts out to external examiners. Much easier to do that with a digital pack than it is with paper-based exams.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and you've mentioned many of the benefits there in terms of the sustainability, the auditable trails, the better experience for students and markers. But of course, there are challenges. And what challenges did you encounter when you first started using the digital assessment tools? And,
Quite a
how
few.
did you address them?
I think that in common with many institutions, universities are fairly change resistant. And so any sort of change, particularly a seismic change, like moving away from paper-based assessment, needs to go through endless committees and hierarchical levels of authority and approval. So change resistance was a big one. And because assessment is such a central part of everything that we do, it also involves multiple stakeholders, multiple departments, if you like. So trying to get lots of people into the tent is less easy than trying to get just one person like Tim into the tent. We also, the way I got round both of those things was just to start really, really small. Start with a pilot, with one class of, in my case, I think it was 57 students. And to make it voluntary, so they could either do it paper or do it digital. And we can talk a bit about how that worked later on, if you like. And then to grow from there. But even doing that pilot threw up some challenges, because we found we were actually using lockdown browser at that point, because these were bring your own device, and they were invigilated, as Tim has just said, but we didn't want them using other mechanisms to cheat. And of course, the several of our students were using less than authentic operating software, shall we say, and Lockdown Browser doesn't like that. So what was really, really important in that case was to have run lots of tests in class and out of class before the summative assessment, so that they got familiar with the software, so that any operating issues were thrown up and could be dealt with in advance, which meant that when we ran that first pilot, and indeed subsequent pilots that followed the same sort of pattern, there were, to my knowledge, I think there was one operating issue in the first 14 pilots that I was part of. And that actually was because somebody used a tablet rather than a proper laptop or PC. So.
I would add another one is the infrastructure required, the physical infrastructure. So I'll tell you the solution the School of Management here at Bath has put for that one in a minute, which is an entirely new building. But yes. that's more coincidental. That wasn't in response. But I remember the original pilots that Don was running in some of the larger venues, because we wanted power to every seat. There was an awful lot of extension cables running across the floor. It became a bit of a trip hazard. So tongue in cheek, I know we've built a new building in the School of Management here at Bath, and every single seat has power to it here. So we've got an advantage in that regard going forward. We don't need the extension cables everywhere.
It's interesting. So the power to every seat, I mean, in your experience of running those exams, is that an issue? Did you have to plan the room for that eventuality that students would be running out of power and would need to plug in somewhere? And is that common?
It's a proven student anxiety point.
Yes.
Right.
Because a lot of them are using laptops a lot, and so they tend to wear out, and they're very, very anxious about sort of older batteries not lasting for the full 2 hours. So as much as for the psychology as for the practicality, it's really important that they feel they have access to power. Yeah. I don't think we need power to every seat. You need power to every 2 seats, because usually if you've got a Wander cable, it's got a couple of sockets on it. So there's ways to make that work. And lots of gaffer tape to stick it to the floor to avoid the trip hazard where possible. But pre-preparation of that, and therefore working with whatever you want to call them, the estates department or the facilities team, in order to install that stuff is another department that needs to be brought into the tent.
Yeah, I mean, in the School of Management, we've just had we had our semester 1 exams in January, and 30 out of the 50 were in Spira on campus. And as I say, because we've got this new building, the power wasn't an issue, but it was a job getting estates and everybody else to buy into it, because they have to be available in case there are technical issues. And in one instance, the central console in the lecture theatre, the power died to it. It didn't die to all the computers in the exam, but the invigilator was trying to throw something up on the board through the projector, and it just died. And it turned out the power cable had severed under the floor somewhere. So, so much for our new building. But it did enable us to get people on board that logistical issue wasn't a big one for us, the power. So we're actually, the school piloted it en masse for the whole university. No other faculty in the university here in Bath used Inspira exams on campus in the way that we did. But the reason people bought into it was because we said, well, look, we've got a building where we can guarantee power to every seat. So that was really helpful.
I know from talking to colleagues in other institutions, it's a real problem, because very often exam venues are gymnasiums, for instance, and it's not exactly practical to put power sockets on the floor right across the gymnasium. It doesn't help balls bounce So that's an issue. And even if you could do that, or if you could suspend power from the ceiling or something of that sort, very often there isn't sufficient power going into that building for 300 or 400 different machines all at once. So it becomes an incredibly expensive problem to remedy if you haven't thought about it in advance.
Yes. And that brings me on to the other issue in the school that people were worried about when we said we want to do all of our exams in this way. They said, oh, what about the reliability of Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
And all 30 exams that we ran in January, there wasn't a single issue with Wi-Fi at all. So we had, at some points, we had 400 students sitting at one time, all drawing on the Wi-Fi, but it just wasn't an issue. But it is something we had to spend 2 or 3 months carefully checking beforehand. So the preparation was the key, really. So it'll be all right on the night.
Yeah, I think we keep hearing that. The preparation is key, as it would be for exams administered in any situation. It's just you're looking at a different set of circumstances. It was interesting, I think, to hear what Donald was saying about the preparedness of the students, because I remember, students, the first time we did digital exams when I was in HE, it was very challenging because they were anxious and they weren't prepared for it. Have you noticed that change over time in terms of how prepared they are to take a digital exam?
I have, yeah, because we actually had the opposite problem. Because when we're in lockdown, all of our exams were remote, administered via Inspira. Students are very used to using Inspira. And for about 3 years, of course, students have been using digital means of assessment because they had no other option. Now, at the start of this academic year, back in October, we made the decision in the school that all of our exams would be on campus, in person, under invigilated conditions. And some unit conveners, so colleagues who were running exams, decided they wanted their exam to be on paper. And the anxiety wasn't about whether students could use computers. The students are very anxious about using a pen. Yeah. So it was completely flipped on its head. And basically, I said, look, you've got 3 months. Practice using a pen. But it was a valid point, because
it is a real point,
if you're going to write for 2 hours with a pen, that takes a certain amount of conditioning, which sounds silly when you're used to doing it, but we have a whole generation of students coming through at the moment who simply aren't used to doing it, I think, and so they need the muscle conditioning. Otherwise, after 20 minutes, their pen's gone down and their hand's hurting. So I actually think the problem's the opposite one now.
Yeah, and it links back, I think, sorry, go ahead, Don.
I was just going to say, it's fascinating because there's also an issue of fairness around this. I was asked in one of these pilots by someone who didn't want to do a digital exam, saying, is it fair? Because some people are faster at writing with a pen than they can type. And I thought, well, that's an interesting problem. But then I thought, actually, because in the past, they've all had to write, and a lot of people, the majority, type faster than they handwrite. So was it ever fair is really the question that needs to be asked back.
And when you made it voluntary at first, what was the take-up like there with that first round of exams? Can you remember?
Various stats came out of that. Yes, I can remember exactly. So of that 57, about 75% opted to go digital. And 25 wanted to do handwriting, so fair enough. I did a bit of research actually in vivo with that lot. So I asked them immediately as they were in the room before sitting the exam about their state of anxiety. And 56% said they were either very worried or a little nervous. And then I asked them again right at the end, so they were still in the room, having just taken their exam, the digital one, how they felt. And that 56 had dropped down to 32% just in the space of 2 hours, which is really quite interesting. But of all of the people who sat it digitally, they all said that they were very happy with it and would do that again. And all of the people who hand wrote said they wished they'd done it on a computer.
Oh, that's really good to hear. And so we've talked a little bit about the challenges though that there are there, but as an academic, what for you are the key drivers? Why go digital with your assessments?
Well, for me, it's about efficiency of processes as much as anything, but also keying into the fact that students they are digital natives, and it's actually a natural thing for them. And I think probably the most nervous person in our January exam period was me. Whereas normally you'd expect students to be nervous before an exam. And I went around every exam venue every day, and they were cool as a cucumber, most of them. So I think it actually plays to their strengths. They actually know what they're doing better than somebody of my generation knows what they're doing with technology. They're very comfortable with it. So I actually think one of the main drivers for me is it reduces barriers, if you like, to accessing. And one of the things we've been pushing at the university more generally is widening accessibility to assessment. And this just allows you so much more scope than a normal pen and paper exam. So that's one of the key things for me. There's also, of course, as I've already mentioned, the being able to send things around to each other digitally, to colleagues digitally, for moderation, for external examining. It's just so much more efficient. And you don't lose papers. So we have had incidences of entire bundles of exam scripts going missing somewhere. That just doesn't happen in the digital. Yeah. Well, we found it doesn't happen in the digital arena.
It's quite hard for the dog to eat a digital file.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. I think the ease of use both by academics and by students is really important. And the continuity from authoring through editing of the exam, managing the whole process, working with professional services, really good. And that leads on then into marking and what have you, portability, auditability, shareability, all those things, lots of abilities.
Yeah. One that actually surprised me, I didn't think about it at the time, but if you find an error on a paper exam paper, it's one heck of a job to undo it. In fact, you tend to just say, let the exam go ahead, and you can't change it. Whereas I did have a colleague in this current semester who spotted an error the day before, and it was a simple matter to correct the paper because it wasn't paper. Where, so instead of 200 reprints required, it was, a few keys, job done. So that was that.
I think the other thing which is really interesting and is still underused in most institutions is the flexibility of the platform, because there are so many formats that you can use to assess knowledge or differently understanding or differently again application. You're not bound by the limitations of paper. And you can do things like working across departments. You can build large question banks which different academics can use, and therefore you level this sort of learning outcome playing field, if you like, sharing those both across time and across divisions. So I think you can increase consistency in that area. And I think you're right, Tim. We have to be very mindful of gaining access. A lot of criticism is thrown at digital exams because some people can't afford laptops and what have you, but institutions have a responsibility to cater with that. And it's not difficult to cater for it.
No, absolutely not. And in our recent session, where the school purchased a standby batch of laptops, I think we purchased 40. And the most we ever saw used in any one session, any one sitting of an afternoon, which could be several exams at once, was about 10 out of the 40 we used. So, but it was there. That's the point. We had the contingency there. And I think that is important. That's because we were using bring your own device exams. There are other models we might move to in the future where we provide laptops for everybody purely for the purposes of the examinations. Obviously, that's quite expensive, but it's something the dean is entertaining and he holds the purse strings.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's that leveling of the playing field there, but then it's also, does the student prefer to have their own device?
Exactly.
Do you hear, is that, Donald, do you hear that from the students? What would they prefer, bring your own device or have it provided for them?
I would say that the vast majority would prefer the familiarity of their own device. And most of that is for fully legitimate reasons. I think it is to do with familiarity. And people with different operating systems might struggle if they're used to a Mac and they get given a PC or vice versa. But I mean, once you're in the exam, it doesn't really make an awful lot of difference. But even small things like keyboard feel or a different type of mouse and stuff can make a difference to their level of comfort. So I think minimizing the amount of change that they face when they go into an assessment is quite a kind thing. I think there are, when thinking about those benefits, there are also some things that you need to do to enhance the benefits. And again, it comes back to preparation. I think training the students, training the invigilators, working with the technical people in order to be prepared for whatever issues might arise is really important. And the more familiar the student body is with doing the sort of exam that you're going to give them online, the more likely they are to be able to get through it without sweat and tears.
So have you found that you've been able, sorry, Tim.
No, sorry, Fiona.
No, how engaging students with those training materials for exams, have you found that successful?
Yes, in short, and certainly when I've done it, I have run different sorts of kind of in-class and out-of-class pilots. Nothing serious. I mean, you can use them as a formative exam, which is a very good way to get familiarity and multi-purposing, if you like. But equally, you can do a 5-minute exam with silly little questions like, what color is Snoopy's nose, or how long does a tomato take to cook? Or, it doesn't really matter what it is that you ask, but they'd have to go into the exam to see the question, to answer it in some way. And if you're doing a multiple choice or a multiple answer, you can structure wacky little questions like that. You can give them an essay of 1 sentence to complete. There's lots of things that you can do just so they're familiar with the platform. And then you might want to do a formative, and that can be in class or out of class, but it gives them a chance to get more involved. And as an academic, it gives you a chance to see where they're at. And broadly speaking, they love it. They think that they can see that it's beneficial to them in terms of familiarity with the platform, but also getting their heads around some of the material and seeing how they're going to be asked questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we did. So we produced a mass demo test. So every student prior to the exam session, which was 1,500 odd students, could access it and have a go. And of that, I think the figures revealed 2/3 of them had done so. And we worked out the third who hadn't, it was because they were already familiar with Inspira from past experience from lockdown. So it was a bigger uptake in our master's students who've come from elsewhere and hadn't necessarily experienced it before, and our first year students as well. So it's a useful thing. But we didn't.
It's worth just adding that it's also really good for the academics to be familiar with it. So encouraging people to run tests is actually helping to train the academics.
Yeah, because that actually was perhaps a bigger issue than getting the students on board. It was getting colleagues to understand what you can do in an Inspira exam. And so I've had quite a job of educating colleagues in that, to the point that I actually mandated that if you could, you should. So if you think you might want paper, I'm telling you, your exam possibly doesn't need paper. It can be done in Inspira. So more and more colleagues are taking it up now.
And certainly, well, I think both of us have produced videos that can be circulated amongst colleagues about how to use it and how it works, and step-by-step guides. And it's tedious to make them, but it's really, really useful, I think, for some of our colleagues who are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, people who might want to try it, but they're wary of the time involved in getting used to using a different, although time saving in the long run, in the short term, you've got to invest that time.
Yeah.
And the more you can help with that, really, the better, those
Yeah.
videos. Yeah, that's really good.
I think what helped, although it's a funny way of thinking about it, I think what helped was, of course, the pandemic. Everybody
Yes.
had to become digitally aware. And so, of course, we're kind of riding that wave as we came out of the pandemic and tried to encourage more uptake in normal times. And more colleagues seem more willing to do so.
And thinking about business schools more broadly, because I think a large number of our audience will be from business schools, how are they in particular, in your experience, using digital assessment, or have they been quick to adopt digital assessment? What have you seen going on in your sector?
I'm not sure that I would associate quick with business school in terms of digital assessment. I think that we were lucky in many ways when I was at Bath as well. We were lucky in that we had done a lot of testing, and that was across different faculties at different levels of student experience in different subject matters with different format types, all sorts of different tests. So when the pandemic came along, we were in a much better place than many institutions enabling the switch to 100% Inspira exams. Many other institutions are still struggling with the idea of whether it's ethically acceptable or whether they have the facilities, or isn't it better to do what we've always done, all that sort of stuff. So I think that it is inevitably going to happen. I think the pandemic, as Tim said, was a strong catalyst for a lot of schools. But of course, a lot of schools during the pandemic reacted very fast, but didn't necessarily jump onto appropriate exam platforms. So a lot of people were trying to use their VLE for digital exams or other forms of home-baked solution, which can, and because these things are not necessarily designed for digital exams, they can create more problems than they cure. So a lot of people would be panic-struck. We were talking about Wi-Fi and bandwidth just now. A proper exam platform like Inspira will be auto-saving each student's work every 15 seconds. But a lot of VLEs will only allow you to upload at the end. So you get this crunch of whatever it is, 200 or 2,000 students all trying to upload something onto a platform at 1 minute before the close of the exam. And surprise, surprise, it falls over. So then they get a bad experience and then they think, oh, we can't do digital exams anymore. You know? So
which is precisely what happened. Actually,
yeah.
We had several colleagues who were doing large in-class tests using Moodle, and they found it just wasn't working because, as Don says, the crunch time of submission, it just overrode it. It blew out the bandwidth. So
yeah.
That required special dispensation, which I think the university actually had to pay for more bandwidth on particular days.
Yes.
Interesting. And then what about, because with the business schools, you'll have the professional regulatory bodies, and how does that impact on the assessments that you do, particularly digital assessments?
Well, in terms of one of the things that I found interesting was the attitude of the accreditation bodies, to be honest. So people like the chartered accountants and those kind of organizations, they were fairly open to it, which surprised me, you know, because you would expect they would want certain particular conditions. But as they told us, as far as I'm aware, because I've spoken to our exams officer, our accreditation officer, she told me that they said, as long as we are happy that the exams are rigorous and we've covered the right content, they are happy too. So I was pleasantly surprised, to be honest. They were very open to it.
Yeah, I think that's my experience as well. I mean, internally, we're not really bothered by regulatory bodies in this sense, only the internal QA policies and all that sort of stuff. But others, I mean, certainly in law, for instance, they're happy with digital exams so long as the exam is invigilated. They want them definitely to be on campus, time delineated and invigilated.
Yeah.
Probably for good reasons.
Yes. So thanks so much. So that was a really rich summary of the current landscape in digital assessment and where the point that we're at now. So for the next 15 minutes or so before we get to questions, perhaps we could look ahead to the future, your predictions there. And something you touched on a little while earlier, I think, on the generative AI tools. And what do you think are the implications for digital exams, first of all, on the rise of generative AI tools?
That's a really interesting one, because I think the answer to that depends on how well you can limit access to them in the exam venue. So we have a model here where we've got an on-campus invigilated model, but obviously within Inspira, there's the possibility of remote proctored exams, which can take place wherever. That is where I think the biggest issue potentially lies, because of course you don't know what anybody's getting up to. You might have remote proctoring on the computer that they are actually using, or for all you know, they've got another one open somewhere else telling them what the answers are, or ChatGPT generating answers for them. So I think from our perspective, which is obviously quite narrow, but from here, we would stick to in-person on-campus exams, just so to ensure that we've got better view of what is actually going on in any situation with any given student. So we know they haven't got access to third-party computers or whatever. But I think it's interesting because there's been a very big debate in the school of late about, oh, ChatGPT. And a colleague of mine has said, well, let's assume that it's got to the end point where it is as fantastic as its potential says it can be. What are we going to do about it? So at the moment, it's kind of about what can it currently do and what do we do about what it can currently do? What we're saying is let's try and get ahead of that and work out what it can do or what it's likely to be able to do eventually. Because I mean, we're in ChatGPT 4 now, aren't we? I think fourth iteration. And I actually think it's something that we need to embrace.
Yes.
And use rather than say, because you can't ban it. There's no way you'll be able to ban it, So we've currently written it into our regulations that you've used ChatGPT if you want, but reference it fully. So yeah. rather than it replace your original thinking, so well, if you've used it, just acknowledge that you used it. Be interesting to see if students do.
It'll be very interesting. I think, broadening out from just digital exams, as you say, there's debate across all these institutions about what to do, and many people tear their hair out and say, ban it, ban it, ban it, it's awful. But you can't do that, as you say, Tim. So I'm definitely of the view, and indeed with my students now, I'm encouraging its use. So not just allowing it, but encouraging it and trying to train the students, not the AI, but trying to train the students on how to use it appropriately as an aid to their learning, as an aid to writing skills or whatever, but absolutely not as a substitute for work. So referencing it properly, be using it as a tool that they can then critique, understanding that it lies through its teeth, if it has teeth, are all kind of important bits of training. And the more that they see that both the benefits and the pitfalls of using it, the less likely I think they are to try and rush into it to answer an exam question, because it may well be lying.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting. So there's a split now, the two routes. There's a route with the real lockdown with exams, with the lockdown browsers and the security there, which it gives you in terms of not being able to copy and paste in from ChatGPT, especially if you're in an exam room, and also authorship verification that Inspira is developing as well. Or there's the routes, which is really interesting. Has it got a role to play in more flexible and creative assessments and with student analysis of what is produced with ChatGPT as well? Interesting to watch that one, I think.
I think it relates to an earlier point. When our students go into the workplace, they will be using AI. Yeah. And so the more we allow them to use it and become work ready, the better they're going to be.
Absolutely. And I think it has lots of very good uses in terms of, assessment. It gets one of the best uses, I think, it gets a student off the blank page, gives them a start, so they can have page 1 written by ChatGPT, and then that makes them think, and they can then carry on.
And they can critique it and carry on. Yeah.
So I think it's got a lot of benefits potentially.
I did ask an AI engine the other day to draw me a picture of fish in the river. Fairly simple. And we can all imagine what that might look like. What came back was packets of salmon fillets floating on the water.
Oh, wow. Fantastic, yeah. Well, that brings us quite nicely, actually, for that discussion there into the next question I had, which was about the role of digital assessment, how it will evolve in how you assess. I mean, you've already touched on this with the discussion we were just having about ChatGPT, and also earlier about the flexibility that there is, and about linking assessment to learning outcomes and the content rather than the vehicle for demonstrating those. So I wondered what your thoughts were for the future of assessment in that way.
Very positive from me. I think it has to be the future. And I also think that's tied in with the fact that at a university such as this one here in Bath, we're obviously looking to expand courses and student numbers in various ways. And one of the obvious ways of doing it when you face a real estate constraint is to have digital programs, which of course will probably need with them digital assessment. So I think it's definitely a future path that you have to go down. I do have a colleague here at the university who's got a sort of doomsday scenario for the next 10 years, which is in 10 years' time, brick and mortar universities will be history. I don't agree with that, but nonetheless, it is a thing worth thinking about as you prepare for a more digitally based educational system as a whole. So of course you need the digital assessment to go hand in hand with that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I did some other research into this area with a bunch of different students, about 580 across 6 different institutions and 3 different countries, actually. And it's interesting that of that little lot, 79% prefer digital exams, so a big majority there. 83% of them thought that it allowed them to express themselves more authentically. I mean, it's difficult to understand what authentic means in that context, but I think that's to do with the ability to present it nicely, to edit and paste and move things around and get to the solution they want rather than this handwritten scrawl. But the real kicker statistic was that 82% of them said they would be more likely to choose a course with digital assessment than one without.
Wow.
So I think that gives us a solid basis, an evidence-based look at how things might progress. It's vital for business schools to adopt it. Schools are going to adopt it. So kids coming up from school will be familiar with this stuff and they'll say, well, what on earth are you doing using quill pens? If they can still remember quill pens. So I think we risk being seen as really archaic if we don't adopt digital exams. But it's important to take advantage of the capabilities of exam platforms like Inspira, rather than just do what we've always done and convert it to a PDF. There's ways of adapting assessment which make them more either AI proof or will work better with AI, that make them more cheat resistant in other ways, which fully play to the advantages of the platform and give the students a better form of assessment. So I think that schools need to learn as well as just jump in.
Absolutely. I think that was a real challenge for many colleagues when we first went into lockdown and we were using remote assessment, which by definition was going to be open book. And it caught several colleagues in several disciplines out. So where they were used to doing a 2-hour limited exam on paper, say in accounting, and getting a good spread of marks, they do the same thing in an open book setting and wonder why the average mark was 85. And clearly what they hadn't done was taken account of the fact that, yeah, we're in a different scenario now and they need to adjust their assessment accordingly, which isn't always easy, I don't think, particularly if you've been doing it for 2 or 3 decades. So, you know, there is a learning curve there.
Definitely.
There is. Yeah, and it's interesting to see assessment at the centre of those discussions now, because I think in my experience for a long time, that the learning and teaching, obviously the pedagogy of the student experience is at the core of what's done in universities, and the assessment is there to demonstrate that they've achieved what we say they can do. But it's interesting now to see this real focus on assessment itself as not being the add-on, as being part of that experience that can make it a more engaging experience for the student if it's done in the right way, and also the awareness in students of feedback practices and academic integrity and different types of assessment that are all becoming core to their experience there. Have you found something similar?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly that there is a much greater interest in and reliance on that whole kind of student experience piece. But I think there's a couple of points I'd make. I think that if assessment tools are used strategically and successfully, they are very much part of the learning experience rather than just a test at the end. And that's important. And again, that plays to how we use these tools properly. So I think that's important. The only thing that I wonder about is that there is quite a lot of psychological and pedagogic evidence that handwriting in certain contexts benefits the learning or the intake of knowledge and understanding. So handwritten note-taking is demonstrated to get stuff in better than any other thing. Clearly, our students don't do that. And I'm not sure whether we would be encouraging them to do it or not, but it's just an interesting kind of side point to bear in mind. It doesn't mean that we should force them to write for 2 hours in an exam, because that's a very different form of using handwriting. But I'm not sure we should say, you know, pens are banned and we're not going to have any paper anywhere on site. It's not really possible, I think.
Yeah, I've noticed quite a few students. The majority are probably tapping away when you're giving a lecture. I just given one this morning. They're all there. I think, crikey, they type very quickly. But some of them do use tablets with a pen. You know, so it's digital writing, but they are writing. So
they're writing. Yeah.
So that might have a place there, I think.
Good point.
Okay, and I think finally, obviously you both have a vast amount of rich experience over the years in creating many different forms of assessment, and you're clearly at the cutting edge still of assessment practices now and fully aware of what it is that your students need and want. And if you are going to give at least one piece of advice, you can give more, to a business school and someone who's really going back and looking at their assessment practices and what they're doing and what they want to do, they want to modernize their approach, what would your advice be to them?
I would do what I've always done. I would advise them to start now, but I'd advise them to start small and to build an evidence base within their institution. I think it's critically important to get the senior leaders of the institution on board as early as possible, so they've got champions to help drive it through, and get colleagues to act as mavens, if you like, so that they can help work with it. Get professional service on board early on, and then the rest of it will come naturally.
I think I would add to that, with your pilots, what I found, and it could just be this university, but what I found is the bodies that give you permission to go ahead and do things slightly differently, they're very concerned about finalist students. So you remove them from the pilots, so they're not a risk factor. And that helped a lot here with getting buy-in from more the central management team.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Yeah. So very careful scoping there of the project and how you want it to progress. And I thought, Donald, that's so interesting, that getting the senior leaders on board and professional services staff, but how do you do that? What's the magic there? Because that can be difficult to do, getting people on board with you. I mean,
it's very difficult to do, yeah. Well, it depends on who they are, of course, and some will be intrinsically favorable before you even start. But I think having an evidence base, and the research that I've done is available, and it definitely shows that there is widespread enthusiasm. The experience of Bath, of Exeter, of other places are very positive. The growing presence, I mean, obviously Inspira's presence across multiple countries around the world is evidence that this thing is an unstoppable force, if you like. But using that evidence to convince people is going to be a good thing. And I think that, you know, the if you like, the intangible or less tangible aspects of it can also be really helpful, because almost every institution is striving for net zero at some point, 2030 or 2035 or 2050, whatever. But this is going to help get them to net zero. So that might tick some boxes for some people. The cost element might help tick some boxes for different sorts of people. Obviously, the costs of printing all of those exam papers and the exam books and shipping them around and storing them is substantial. And whilst Inspira isn't cheap, definitely represents greater value and you know, financial savings. So there's lots of different tools, and I think picking the tool that's going to be appropriate for the person you're trying to convince is probably the best way forward.
Yeah, agreed.
So, yeah, that's great. That's so interesting. Thank you very much. Is there anything else that you'd like to comment on or add before we go to the questions?
I think there's one little point. I think that we are going to see, at least I hope, and you can answer this for us, but we're going to see increasing types of diversity across exams, what the platforms are capable of doing. And I think that students are very interested in having more and more different sorts of exams. So whether they're multiple choice or multiple answer or mathematical equations or whatever, but moving into other forms which might be more exciting. So an online simulation could be part of a digital exam platform. Maybe working with AI within the platform would be very interesting, and getting them to use critique an AI answer or something would be interesting. Getting them to create a prompt for an AI and see what comes out would be an interesting thing. So somehow integrating an AI platform with an exam platform would be fun. I think there's going to be increasing use of AI in the back end. So I can see that there might be increasing use of automatic feedback, for instance. We need to be very careful how AI generates that, because we wouldn't want it to lie. But I'm sure we could provide it with sufficient sort of learning and evidence that it would be able to do that well. So I look forward to that. I think it's going to be really exciting. And I think linking a student as an individual across a range of different assessments through a range of time will be much more possible, and help them to shape their own learning and see how they're progressing by using data analysis coming out of e-exams.
Yes. Yeah, I think that point about data analysis is a really important one, because it dawned on me not long ago that actually we in exam boards, we see the spread of marks. Students never see that. We don't issue that to students. And it'd be much better if they could have access to a broader range of data so they knew where they stood relative to their peers, because the only way they find out is by chatting to their peers. So they have a very small sample, but they may think they're doing very well, but actually they could be in the lower quartile for all they know. You know, I think the more data they have, the better, and the digital platforms give us scope to provide access to that in a way that we currently don't really have.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's exciting times indeed, and part of our mission, I have to say it, but I also believe it, it's why I joined Inspira after many years in HE, is this evolution of assessment, because of the impact that it has on the student experience, on the outcomes. If it's done well, it's a really integral part of learning and a really positive experience for both students and academics. It doesn't have to be this hugely stressful beast that it can be.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think digital can help with that at least. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating and interesting to get your experiences. Loads of little nuggets there that I was noting down from what you've learned over the years and what you think about is to come. I think we might have a few questions in the chat, Natalia, if you've picked up on those.
Absolutely, we do have a few questions. The first question: how does the platform allow for graphs, drawings, special symbols, calculations for finance and economics?
I can answer that one, being an economist. So yeah, you can give students the option. There is a drawing tool, but equally there is also an option for using special scanning paper which will link, which is what we do in the school at the moment. We have the scanning paper, and so they type their essay into Inspira, they draw a relevant diagram, and that is collected in at the end of the exam and scanned through the special software, which then links it directly, a digital copy of it, to the exam paper. So the unit convener, the marker, just sees a unified document at the end. So that of course, that allows for all sorts of handwriting. You can have mathematical symbols. In terms of finance stuff, you can have mathematical symbols as well. So there is an equation editor in there. But again, many colleagues opt for the scanning paper because it's perhaps quicker to draw mathematical symbols than it is to use an equation editor. But other colleagues take a different perspective on that. They say, well, I'm just going to get the students used to using the equation editor in Inspira prior to the exam. So, you know, so it does cater for diagrams, it does cater for mathematical expressions.
And of course, it can simulate spreadsheets and all that sort of stuff as well. So we're not limited to just a word editor.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the second question, how does Inspira help you in terms of making the grading of papers more efficient? You still have to read the essay, for example. Are there ideas to include AI into the grading process in Inspira?
You still have to read the essay if it's an essay-based question. However, it's more efficient in lots of different ways. It's efficient in that you can, across a cohort, you can choose how you want to mark it. So if you've got more than one question, which I guess most exams do, you can then mark it as a question, mark question 1 across the whole cohort, and then come back and mark question 2 across the whole cohort, which makes it quicker and more efficient, as long as you don't get too bored. Or you can do student by student, or you can do section by section. So answers 1 to 5, for instance, across the whole cohort, and then follow on. So there's ways to organize it which are better. It allows you to annotate, to create notes, either notes for student if you want to give them feedback, or notes to co-markers or notes to moderators on the individual scripts whilst you're in the platform, so that's quick and efficient. And of course, it then records all the grades, and with integration with platforms like SITS, it allows those grades to go straight into the central system rather than you having to rekey them with all the potential errors that can occur there. And in terms of AI, well, yes, I think is the answer, but I'm not really qualified to answer it.
I think the other thing I would add, which Don mentioned quite a while ago now, is it improves the efficiency of marking simply because you can read it.
Yes.
We've probably all had a high proportion of exam papers where the handwriting is challenging.
Yes, and I think from Inspira, in terms of AI, it's certainly not on the roadmap yet, but I was having a chat with this about this with a colleague this morning, and I think my thoughts on that are the student experience, really, if they're paying their student fees to be seen by an academic, an expert in their field who sees the work that they've done, perhaps their individual improvement, and can give feedback on that. I don't know how a student would respond to AI feedback. Perhaps very well. Maybe there's room for it, perhaps in early stages of essay drafts or something similar. But I think there's always going to be, for the student, this expert feedback from a professional in their field on how they're doing as an individual.
Yes.
Thank you. And another question we got, do you think that online assessments are more akin to tasks that students might face in the workplace rather than just a memory exercise?
That's a good one. The short answer I would suggest is probably yes, but I'd have to think about it more to give you a more detailed answer. I don't know, Don, what?
I would very much hope the answer is yes.
Yes.
I'm not convinced it always is, but I would hope that it should be. And it comes back to what we were saying earlier on. I think we need to rethink the way that a lot of assessments are set in order that they are relevant to the workplace and that they do test more than just memory. We don't want to produce a bunch of parrots. We want to produce people who can understand concepts and apply them, knowing that they're going to use Google to look everything up. So the knowledge becomes less relevant than the understanding and the application.
Yeah, I think another thing, having thought about it now for a couple of minutes, is in the field of accounting and finance, of course, the people are going to use a lot of spreadsheets. They can use programming. You can actually do that in a digital assessment live. So, and I know colleagues have been doing that, and they really value the ability to create an assessment that actually involves using Excel spreadsheets. So students have to create them rather than a pen and paper exam where you don't get that opportunity.
Thank you. Another question. Do you think there's a danger for well-being if online assessments are able to take place at home, as there isn't a separation of space between examination and relaxation?
Yes, is the short answer to that. Almost certainly, because which is one of the reasons why we brought all our assessments onto campus. So there's parity, there is availability of resourcing, availability of space, and we can provide the spare laptops if anybody doesn't have a laptop, which doesn't happen often at our place, but I can understand it does happen. So I'd say the answer to that is probably yes. And we've kind of got around it by saying, well, we're not having remote assessment any longer, because our experience over the last the experience over lockdown was quite a few students were having issues because of their home life. You know, the places they were trying to sit assessment just weren't suitable.
Yeah, I agree. And we obviously have to be really, really cognizant of those issues. That I think there's a minority of people for whom that is going to be a serious challenge. And for the majority, there is already a serious blurring, because people will be working at 3 in the morning in their bed, or they'll be doing all sorts of other bits and pieces. So that there is already that crossover. And that's replicated in work life, because many places in work are now hybrid. So half the time you're working from home, half you're working at the institution. So yeah, I mean, it's an issue. We need to be aware of it. We need to find ways of dealing with it. But I'm not sure we need to say no digital exams as a consequence.
Fantastic, thank you. We do also have a question. I missed the first half of the session. Is there a way to access the recorded session? And absolutely, we will send an email out to everyone once the recording is live, to let everyone know, so that it will be available. It will be also on our website, so you will not miss it. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you once again to our panel and our partner Inspira for such fascinating insight. Thank you all for joining us and for your brilliant questions and interactions. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did. But like I said, if you missed anything, don't worry, because the recording will be available in post-event comms and on the AMBA and BGA websites within a week. Thank you once again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.